Now, before we pick up where we left off last week, actually it was 2 weeks ago, I guess, but before we pick up where we left off last time, let's say it that way, let me remind you of a few things. First of all, we're in the second section of the book, which is the pronouncement of judgment on 8 different nations. 6 of those nations are pagan nations, or what we would call Gentile nations. The other 2 are Judah and Israel. Now, at the present time, we're looking at the pronouncement of judgment upon Edom, which is found in verses 11 and 12. The second thing I want to remind you of is that the pronouncement of judgment against Edom is different than all the others. Because in all the others it says, for 3 transgressions and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof. But only the 4th sin is mentioned, like the other 3 really don't matter. The sin that caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow is the only one it really mentions. But when it comes to Edom, the 3 sins that fill God's cup of wrath to the brim are listed, along with the 4th sin, which caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow. So let's look at the 4 sins that are listed in verse number 11. It says, thus saith the Lord. And again, notice that the word Lord is in all caps. What does that tell you? It tells you that this word is translated from the Hebrew word Yahweh. It's the redeeming, covenant-keeping name of God. So here the Lord is saying this. For 3 transgressions of Edom and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof. Because sin number 1, he did pursue his brother with the sword. And sin number 2, he did cast off all pity. And sin number 3, his anger did tear perpetually. In sin number 4, he kept his wrath forever. So those are the 4 sins that they were guilty of. Number 1, they pursued their brother with a sword. Now, of course, this is referring to Israel. You see, the nation of Israel are the descendants of Jacob, whom God renamed Israel. The nation of Edom are the descendants of Esau, whose nickname was Edom. And Jacob and Esau were brothers. So from God's perspective, the nation of Edom and the nation of Israel are brothers, because their eponymous ancestors were brothers. Does that make sense? Remember what the word eponym means? An eponym is a person that either something or a group of people are named after. So Israelites are actually named after the person Jacob, who God had renamed Israel. So when we refer to Israel, they get their name from one person, Israel. Well, the Edomites are the same way. They get their name, the nation of Edom gets their one name from Edom, and that was the nickname of Esau. And Jacob and Esau were brothers. So when God says that Edom pursued his brother with a sword, he's talking about Israel. Number 2, they had no pity on Israel, even when others attacked them, such as the Assyrians and the Babylonians. In fact, they always rejoiced when calamity came upon Israel. Why? Because they have this inward bitterness towards the Jews. It's ingrained within them. It's almost like it's part of their DNA, and we're going to find out why in just a little bit. Number 3, their anger towards Israel never subsided. You know, sometimes someone does something against us and we get angry, but you know, the years go by and pretty soon you can't even remember why you were angry at them. But I want you to understand it wasn't that way with Edom. Their anger towards Israel never subsided, to the point that it carried over from one generation to the next. And we're talking about over a 3,500 to 4,000 year period, which led to the 4th sin that caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow. And this 4th sin is why we have such problems in the Middle East today, and why there will always be problems in the Middle East until Jesus Christ returns. Now, I know politicians can't say that, and you have to be careful saying that, but let me just give you the cold, hard facts. There will never be any peace in the Middle East until Jesus Christ returns. And it has nothing to do with what Israel has done or will do in the future. It has to do with this eternal hatred that the Muslims have for the Jews, and I'll explain why they have that in just a little bit. So now this brings us to the 4th sin. What is the 4th sin of Edom? The sin that caused God's cup of wrath to overflow. Well, here it is. Edom has an eternal hatred for Israel. Now, the way the King James Version says it is this: he kept his wrath forever. But what that means is that Edom always has and always will have hate towards Israel. And I explained why last time. Now, if you weren't here last time, let me just tell you that it all goes back to Esau. You see, Esau was the epitome of a problem child, and he caused his parents, Isaac and Rebekah, all kinds of grief. He did whatever he wanted whenever he wanted, and he never considered the implications or the consequences of his actions. And like all problem children, it was never his fault. That's the one common characteristic that all problem children have. You see, there's all types of problem children. You have those problem children that are just rebellious. You have those problem children that tend to go towards crime. You have problem children that get into drugs and alcohol. You have problem children who don't do well in school. You have problem children who are lazy. You have problem children who will never get a job. They're always dependent on their parents. So there's all types of different problem children. You can't really come out and say, a problem child is this. And the reason they're termed problem children is because they are a perpetual problem to their parents. But they all share one common characteristic. And a good counselor knows this. And you have to get to the bottom of it. The common characteristic is this. It's never their fault. Now, here's what's interesting. Whatever Esau's parents wanted him to do, he did just the opposite. First, he married 2 Canaanite women, which made his parents' life a living hell. Look at Genesis chapter 26, verses 34 and 35, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. It says, at the age of 40, now let's be honest. By 40, he should have been married. But he wasn't married. Why wasn't he married? Because in that day and time, you had arranged marriages. And it was the father's responsibility to determine whether his son was responsible enough to take a bride. So he determined the time. And here he is, 40 years old. Now, if you go back a little bit further, you'll find out that Abraham waited with Isaac until he was 40. But the reason he did is because he didn't want anyone around them to marry his son, so he actually had to send someone to a different place to get his wife. But that wasn't the case for Esau, because Isaac knew exactly where he should be sending his son to get his wife. But the reason he didn't is because Esau was irresponsible. He wasn't ready for a wife. So Esau took things into his own hands, and he didn't wait for his parents to arrange his marriage. He just went out and he married 2 Hittite women. Notice what it says. At the age of 40, Esau married 2 Hittite wives, Judith, the daughter of Beri, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon. But Esau's wives made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah. Now, of course, Jacob waited to get married because he was a good son and he wanted to please his parents. He was responsible. I know most of us have been taught that he hasn't, but you don't understand Jewish culture. So when you read the story, you don't understand what it's saying. When it says Jacob was a plain man, it means he was a man of business. When he stayed in the tents, it means that he was an industrious person who took his father's business very seriously, and it's one of the reasons that Isaac prospered. But he wasn't going to go out and find his own wife. He was obedient. He was going to wait for his parents to arrange a marriage. The problem is he wasn't the firstborn. And if you're not the firstborn, you can't get married until the firstborn does. How many of you remember when Jacob goes off and, he wants this girl of his dreams, and then his father-in-law pulls the fast one over on him? You remember that? Leah sneaks her in there. He gets, which should teach you a little bit about drinking. He gets a little bit too drunk. He goes in on his honeymoon. He wakes up the next morning. He slept with the wrong woman. He says, "What have you done to me?" Well, she's the oldest. And our custom is, it was a custom of all of those nations back then. So Jacob has to wait, and he does wait. He's the responsible one. So after, of course, Esau went out and obtained his own wives on his own. Then Jacob followed his parents' instructions. He went to Padan Aram to obtain a wife instead of marrying Canaanite women. So he also went there because Esau threatened to kill him, and Rebekah was afraid that Esau just might do it because she knew that he was a man of passion. Now, the reason Esau wanted to kill Jacob was because he felt that the birthright should have gone to him instead of Jacob. You see, Esau never had any intention of honoring his word when he sold his birthright to Jacob. No. That's why he wanted the blessing. The blessing was the official impartation of the birthright, and it should have gone to Jacob in the first place because Esau had sold it to him. Now, this is a very important story in the Old Testament. If you don't understand it, even when you get into the New Testament, you don't quite understand certain things. How many of you remember in one of the prophets where it says, "Esau have I hated, Jacob have I loved"? And Calvinists use that to show that before they were ever born, God just predestined Jacob to be the one he loved, and he's the one that was going to be chosen, and Esau he just hated before he's even born. That's not what that means at all. You have to understand Hebrew and understand the covenant terms and terminology. And what it's actually saying, it's saying Esau's character I hated. Why? because he was a profane, ungodly man. Jacob have I loved. It's not that Jacob didn't make mistakes. Jacob made mistakes, but he was a man who really wanted the things of God. Now let me say this, or let me ask this question, because if you don't get this, you really don't understand what's happening and why there's such an animosity between the Muslims and the Jews today. How many of you understand the connection between the blessing and the birthright? Is there anyone here that doesn't understand it? Raise your hand, because I really want to make sure. Okay, there's a few people that don't, so let me explain this. The birthright should go to the firstborn son, but the firstborn son had to prove that he was worthy of it, and here's why. Let's suppose that you had 5 sons. When you got ready for the inheritance, when the father died, the inheritance would be divided in 6 ways. The 5 sons plus 1 extra. So instead of dividing it 5 equal ways, you divide it in 6 equal ways. And the firstborn, if he was deemed worthy and received the birthright, he was the first in line to receive the birthright. He had to show himself worthy, though, first. But he received the birthright, and he got 2/5. Everyone else got 1/5. But the reason he got 2/5 is because he was assuming the role of the father, and he would be the head of the clan. And it was his responsibility to take care of the widow that was left behind, his mother, any of the widowed sisters that he might have, or anyone else that was in the home. So he was financially responsible for them, and as a result, he got an extra share. That is known as the birthright. The only problem is you don't want someone to be head of the clan. You don't want someone to be responsible for all the widows and all the single women and all the others who are dependent if they're not responsible. So even though the firstborn should receive the birthright, it didn't automatically go to him. They could be disqualified if they were not a responsible person. We see that with Jacob's oldest son. Slept with one of his father's concubines, disqualified him. We find out later that Joseph becomes the one who gets the birthright, and the blessing goes to him. Most of us don't understand what the coat of many colors were. I've taught on that. You have to go back and listen to that. But anyways, here's how it happened. When the father got to the point where he thought, I'm getting close to death, I've been able to observe my sons, I can now see that either my oldest son is responsible or he's not responsible. I now come out and I give the blessing. The blessing is the impartation of the birthright. It's the official impartation. And what you're supposed to do is have a big banquet. And at this big banquet, you're now going to talk about the person receiving the birthright, and you give him the blessing. It's the one that imparts the birthright. He will now be the head of the clan. He will take my place when I die. He's the one that will settle all the arguments. He's the one that makes the decisions for the family. He's the one that takes care of all the single ladies. Everyone with me? And then everyone else, all the other sons, everyone else gets a blessing, not the blessing. Now, we know that Esau was not a man of character, and the reason we know that he wasn't a man of character is because he sold his birthright to Jacob. But he had no intention of honoring that because he wanted the blessing. And what did the blessing do? It officially imparted the birthright. So that tells us right away that he had no intention of honoring his word when he sold the birthright to Jacob. And what's worse is that Isaac was not going to honor his word. That's why Rebekah did what she did. Now, here's what's interesting, and this is what you'll find even in life, but this is a biblical principle. Just because it's the right thing to do doesn't mean that it's right to do it. Rebekah had the right to do what she did, but the way she went about doing it was wrong. We know that Isaac was trying to pull a fast one, and the reason we know that is because you're supposed to have this huge banquet when you impart the blessing. And so when he got ready to do this, he was going to do it in private. He told him to go out and kill a goat, make me this meat, come into my tent alone. Why was he doing this? Because he knew Rebekah would be upset. What he didn't know was she was listening by the tent, and when she heard this, what did she do? She goes to Jacob and said, Dad of yours. And so she does what she does. But the reason she did it is because Isaac should have never honored Esau with the birthright. Now, when Esau realized that Jacob would receive a double portion of the inheritance and not him, he did everything he could to spite his family, his parents. like it was their fault and not his. He didn't look at his own mistakes. He didn't look at his own character. He didn't look in the mirror and say, I got what I deserve. Oh no, he's a problem child. He's the epitome of a problem child. And a problem child, it's never their fault. So what did he do? He blamed his parents. Turn to Genesis chapter 28, verses 8 and 9, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Because from this point on, he does everything he can to spite them. It says, it was now very clear to Esau that his father did not like the local Canaanite women. So Esau visited his uncle Ishmael's family and married one of Ishmael's daughters. Now, this is interesting because you'll have some commentators who don't understand the culture who'll say, oh, see, he was just trying to please his father. He knew they didn't like the Canaanite women, so he went over to Ishmael, his stepbrother, and he was going to marry one of his daughters to try and please him. Oh, no, not at all. He didn't do this to please his father. He did this to spite his father. He knew that there was animosity between Ishmael and Isaac, and that's why he did it. And to top it off, after he does this, he leaves his parents, which is a break of etiquette. In fact, here's what he's actually telling his parents when he does that. You don't want to give me the birthright? I'm not going to take care of you when you get old. I'm leaving you. No eldest son would have ever done that, but he did that. He left his parents and went and lived with his in-laws. So, let's keep reading. In addition to the wives he already had, his new wife's name was Mahalath. She was the sister of Nebaioth and the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son. So Esau married his first cousin Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael. And Esau went to live in the same area as his uncle and father-in-law Ishmael, and his children continually intermarried with the descendants of Ishmael, and they became the nation of Edom. But he married Ishmael's daughter just to spite his parents. In fact, it wasn't enough that he married the daughter of his father's arch nemesis. Oh no. He had to take it a step further and go live with them as a show of defiance that, all right, I'm not going to get the birthright. Take care of yourself when you're old. I'm going over here. I'm going to your arch nemesis. But here's the deal. Both Esau and Ishmael were problem children. And they both resented Isaac to the point of hatred. The bitterness inside of them consumed them. They never saw it as their fault. The whole reason that Ishmael was kicked out is because not only was he bullying Isaac, but he was purposely doing things to hurt him if you read the story. And what's happened is they instilled this bitterness and this resentment within their children. You see, from Ishmael's point of view, it was all Isaac's fault that he and his mother had to leave the family. And it was all Isaac's fault for making him look bad. And Isaac was why he wasn't going to be the heir or the firstborn to Abraham. From Esau's point of view, it was Isaac's fault for giving the birthright to Jacob. And it was Jacob's fault for being a goody two-shoes and sucking up to the parents and making Esau look bad, which is the typical perception of a problem child. Now, the Arabs are the descendants of Abraham through Esau, Ishmael, and the sons of Keturah. So as I told you last time, Iranians are not Arabs, they're Persians. Egyptians are not Arabs. Turks are not Arabs, they're descendants from the Scythians from Central Asia. Now, you probably heard it Scythians, but that's not the correct pronunciation. It's Scythians unless you're Greek. If you ever go to Egypt, you'll go to Bet Shin. But they'll refer to it as Scythopolis, and the reason they will is because that was one of the cities of the Decapolis, the 10 cities of Rome. Now, it originally was Bet Shin. That's where Saul's body was hung up on the wall. And you ever go there, it's kind of neat. You can go up on the place where the main fortress was and where Saul's body would have been hung. But they call it Scythopolis because when Rome came in, they rebuilt the city. And in order to give the land to the Scythians who were mercenaries for them, they gave them the city. So they renamed it Scythopolis. And so we have the tendency to pronounce it Scythians, but it's actually Scythians, and they're from the steppes of Central Asia. But they are not Arabs. And here's what's interesting. The media doesn't know that, and neither do our experts. I have heard Hillary Clinton and both John Kerry refer to the Middle East as the Arab world. You want to make the Iranians mad? You want to make those people mad in Turkey? Call that the Arab world, because they are not Arabs. They are Persians if they're in Iran. Now, in Turkey, they're Seljuk Turks. You have to understand the Scythians coming in and the names that they took and became part of the Ottoman Empire. That was a family. That's where the Ottoman Empire name comes from. But here's what's interesting. Our politicians at the highest level don't understand why there's animosity in the Middle East today. If you don't understand history, you don't understand what's going on. In fact, I'm going to share some things tonight that will open up your eyes to why there will never be peace in the Middle East, and it will open up your eyes to how the Palestinians are being used as pawns. But anyways, I'm going off on things. True Arabs are the descendants of Abraham through Esau, Ishmael, and the sons of Keturah. Take a look at the slide. This is the slide that I showed you last time. If you look at this, Abraham had 3 wives. He had Sarah, and from Sarah, he had the promised child Isaac. Isaac, of course, has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Then he had Hagar. In fact, he actually had Ishmael before because Sarah was unable to get pregnant. It wasn't until after menopause that God did this miraculous work in her womb. So literally, Isaac was not only a child of promise, but he was a miracle child. Because she was past the age of being able to give birth. She had reached the age of menopause and been many years. Her body was dead. But anyways, he had Ishmael. And of course, Ishmael has to leave. He goes out and he marries a Hagarine. That means an Egyptian. So anyways, coming in and looking at this, because he refers to them as Hagarines because her name was Hagar. And she was an Egyptian. So many times in the Bible, Egyptians are referred to as what? Hagarines. Because of Hagar. It simply means Egyptians. And then he marries Keturah. This is after Sarah dies. Hagar's been sent away. And he has 6 sons. Now we see the descendants where Saudi Arabians come from. And the Bedouins, which literally become, what's kind of interesting, Nabateans. Now, Muhammad was an Arab, a descendant of Ishmael. And he had an intense hatred of the Jews, which he incorporated into the religion that he created, which is Islam. And through the spread of Islam, this hatred for Israel has been passed on to all Muslims. But my point is this. Almost all Arabs are Muslims, but not all Muslims are Arabs. And we have the tendency to think that, but it's not true. But through the teaching of Islam, all Muslims are taught to hate Israel. Is everyone with me? Now, someone says, Pastor, you make all these statements. Well, I'm probably the only pastor in Tahlequah, Oklahoma that's actually read the Quran. And I taught on Islam in the end times. And let me show you some interesting scriptures that talks about the Jews. Because when I make these statements, people go, I don't believe that. Well, then you actually need to read the Hadiths and you need to read the Quran. Let me read, if you don't mind. And I'm at that age where I have to have reading glasses. I'm going to read from Surah 5, which means chapter, verse number 51. And I want you to notice what it says. O you who believe, take not the Jews and the Christians for friends. They are friends of each other. And whoever amongst you takes them for friends, he is indeed one of them. Surely Allah guides not the unjust people. So he's telling you, don't take for friends Christians and Jews. If you do, then Allah has nothing to do with you. Now that's kind of interesting because we're seen as the big Satan and Israel is seen as the little Satan. Christians and Jews they see as friends. They understand the alliance that we have with them, and they can't stand it. But this goes all the way back to Muhammad. Now, look at verse number 60. This is still in Surah 5. It says, say, shall I inform you of those worse than this in retribution from Allah? They are those whom Allah has cursed, and upon whom he brought his wrath, and of whom he made apes and swines, and who serve the devil. These are in the worst plight and further astray from the straight path. Now, who's he talking about that he says he turned them into apes and swine? Does anyone know? Jews. Let me read from their best and most renowned commentator. Here's what he says. Those who are spoken of as having been made apes and swine are the Jews. And that's why you see in their cartoons, they'll always show the Jews as apes or pigs. They'll put them in dressed like that, and they'll give them an ape's face, or they'll give them a pig's face. Because why? Because that's what Muhammad said. Now, this goes to 929. Surah 9 is actually, if you don't know this, this is the Surah of the sword. And that means this is the place where you're told to kill everyone who's not an unbeliever. Fight those who believe not in Allah, nor in the last day, nor forbid that which all in his messengers have forbidden. You drink alcohol, then you're supposed to be fought. You do things that they say not to do, then you're to be fought. Those who believe not in Allah, nor in the last day, nor forbid that which Allah and his messenger have forbidden, nor follow the religion of truth. In other words, if you're not a Muslim, out of those who have been given the book. Who's been given the book? The Jews, until they pay tax in acknowledgement of superiority, and they are in a state of subjection. So they have been told to continually fight the Jews until they bring them into subjection, and they're to either kill them or make them pay the jizya tax. And if you've been to my teaching on that, you understand exactly what that is. So I'm not just making this up. There's this intense hatred between the descendants of Ishmael and Esau, and then when Muhammad comes along, he incorporates this intense hatred into this religion that he creates, which is Islam, and that's why today the Muslims hate the Jews. And if you listen to them, there is no peace, and it doesn't matter what Israel does. Israel could give them all of the land, and they would still want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. That's just the way they are. And if you've never traveled over to Israel or Jordan or Egypt or any of the Muslim countries, then you don't know what you're talking about. I've been there. I know how they are. I can go further and tell you stories, but I need to get on with it. Now, where did the Edomites settle? They're the descendants of Esau. Where did the Edomites settle? Well, originally they settled in the area between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. Here's a simple map which shows where Edom was located. Look at this. If you notice, you see the Dead Sea. See where it says Moab? That's the Dead Sea. Right above that is the Sea of Galilee, and the Jordan River is connecting the Sea of Galilee all the way to the Dead Sea. Now, there's no way out for the water, or there's no way for the water to get out of the Dead Sea, so it just kind of collects there. It's down below sea level, and so everything just collects there, and that's why it's all salt and has all of these natural minerals. In fact, a lot of the probably cleansing units that you use, women, come from the Dead Sea. But anyways, that's there. There's no way for that water to get out. So right south of that, you see Basra and Taman, that's Edom, and then you come down to the Gulf of Aqaba. So from the Dead Sea to the Gulf of Aqaba, that's where the Edomites settled. Now, during the period known as the Babylonian captivity, the Nabateans migrated into Edom, and I'll explain why and how in just a little bit. Just hang on. The Nabateans were nomads who dwelled in tents in the desert. In fact, the reason we know a little bit about that is because of Josephus. If you don't mind, do you guys mind if I read from Josephus? Well, if you don't mind, great. If you do mind, I'm still going to do it. Here's what it says, because I want you to understand, we get this from extra biblical material. We're not just making this stuff up. Here's what Josephus writes about. Does anyone know when Josephus lived? During the rebellion, 70 AD. In fact, he even talks about Jesus in his writings, and most people don't even know that. Maybe I'll read that for you sometime. But he talks about him being, the report of him being raised from the dead. Talks about him working miracles, and everyone knows about him. So Jesus wasn't something that was made up. Extra biblical material talks about him. And Josephus, who would have been this generation, who was probably a child shortly after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, because literally he becomes a turncoat. And if you understand, he switched sides, went to the Romans in order to spare his life, and then he becomes this historian, and he writes this, and we get all of this information from him. But notice what he says. When the lad was grown up, and he's talking about Ishmael, I'm not going back to let you know that, just telling you. When the lad, Ishmael, was grown up, he married a wife by birth, an Egyptian. We know that, a Hagarine. From thus the mother was herself derived originally. Of this wife were born to Ishmael 12 sons, and then he names them as they are listed in the Bible: Nebaioth, Kedar, Abdil, Mibzan, Duma, Mishma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, Kedema. These inhabited all the country from the Euphrates to the Red Sea and called it Nabatene. So this is where we get the Nabateans. You have the Edomites from Esau, and then you have the Nabateans, who are the descendants of Ishmael. They are an Arabian nation. They're Arabs. That's how we know they were Arabs, and we know who the Arabs are from Josephus. They are an Arabian nation, and named their tribes from these, both because of their own virtue and because of the dignity of Abraham, their father. Now, believe it or not, the Nabateans were extremely wealthy because they constantly traveled back back and forth from the bottom of Arabia, where Yemen is today, all the way to Damascus in Syria, traveling in caravans. And they would buy goods in Yemen. And these goods came from these places like India and northeastern Africa. So you had all of these spices and all of these great things coming up, and they were buying them at a very cheap price. And then they would take them on these caravans from Yemen, the southern part of Arabia, all the way up to Damascus, and they would sell them there. And then they would buy goods in Damascus that you couldn't get down south in India, northeastern Africa, or even in Yemen. And then they would take them back and they would sell them there. And they never paid any taxes. All of these other caravans had to pay taxes. Why did the Nabateans not have to pay taxes? Does anyone know? It's because whenever the officials came, they ran into the desert. And they knew where all the watering holes were, and they kept them hidden. In fact, they even built hidden cisterns in the desert. So they never paid taxes on anything they did. Actually, they were the bootleggers. And they became extremely wealthy with their caravans. But after 582 BC, many of them migrated into Edom and began occupying what was once Edom. Look at this other map. Now you see, here's the Nabateans. Edom is right here, but they start coming in, and notice that arrow? They're now going to come in, and they start migrating into Edom. Now, let me explain why this migration took place, because if you ever travel over there, they'll tell you about this migration, but most of them don't understand how or why it took place. So I'm going to explain that. In 586 BC, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and carried almost all of the Jews into captivity, it created a vacuum in the southern part of Judea, because you had all of this unpopulated land with homes and cities that were empty. They were ghost towns. Why? Because when the Babylonians came in and they destroyed Jerusalem and they destroyed the temple, Jeremiah had told them, just submit, this is part of God's plan. But they didn't submit. And as a result, they came in and they destroyed it. And then, instead of taking away, they'd already taken away 2 groups to exile. Now they took just about everyone except the poorest of the poor. They went down into Hebron, they went down in the Negev, and they took everyone that was a Jew and they took them captive. And they didn't go to the capital. They went to the agriculture sites. That's where Ezekiel was. And they were hard laborers for the Babylonians. And they're not going to be able to come back until Cyrus comes along. But now you have all of these deserted cities and the deserted homes, and the Edomites are over here, and they're not even living as good of land. So they see these empty cities. They see these empty homes, except for just a few people. So guess what they do? A few of them, and I should say probably a third of them, moved in and took advantage of the situation. And they made Hebron their capital. Now, why did they make Hebron their capital and not Jerusalem? Does anyone know? Because Jerusalem was destroyed. Hebron wasn't even touched. When they destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, I'm telling you, it just killed the heart of the Jews, and they just gave up. So when the Babylonians marched in, man, they just walked out of their city and said, we're going into captivity. So all of the cities that were south of Judea, man, they were left unharmed. They didn't even touch them. So now you have all of these cities and these homes. It's like a ghost town. So you've got a group of Edomites that take advantage of the situation. So now what happens is they move over. But let me go a little bit further. This is not an accurate map. Does anyone know why? See that word Gaza? Anyone heard of Gaza today? The Gaza Strip? That's where the Philistines lived. They actually even moved over there and took over the Philistines' land. Does anyone know why they did that? Because in 586, when they destroyed Jerusalem, they also went in and they destroyed the Philistines. And because the Philistines tried to fight them, they took all of the Philistines into exile, and they never came back. And so the Edomites actually moved into southern Judea and also took over the Philistines' land. Now, the land they occupied became known as Idumea. You'll hear some pastors refer to it as Idumea, but it's actually Idumea. Idumea is just the Greek word for Edom. So Edom moved from east of the Dead Sea to west of the Dead Sea. Now Hebron remained under Edomite control until Judah's Maccabeus retook the city in 164 BC. And 38 years later, the high priest John Hyrcanus gave all the Edomites an ultimatum. And this was the ultimatum. You either convert or you move. If you don't convert, you have to move. If you don't do either, we're going to kill you. So guess what they did? They converted. But of course it didn't mean anything. It was just a way to stay in the country. But the Romans didn't know that. So in 47 BC, they named Antipater, an Edomian, as the procurator over Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. And he had a son. And you know him as Herod. And in 37 BC, they named his son Herod the Great as king over Israel. And now you understand why the Jews hated Herod the Great. It's because he was an Edomian, an Edomite. And they never accepted him or his sons because they knew that he was not a true Jew. He was an Edomite who had an everlasting hatred for the Jews. But the Romans didn't know that. In fact, in 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, the Edomites rejoiced. Just like they did in 586 BC when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. They just didn't know that the Babylonians would have come down 4 years later and get them too. But the reason they rejoiced is because they have this eternal hatred towards the Jews, towards Israel. So, let's look at the judgment that was pronounced upon Edom. Look at verse number 12. A lot of information before we get to these two verses, right? Here's verse 12. But I will send a fire upon Teman, which shall devour the palaces of Bozrah. Now, Teman and Bozrah refer to districts, not cities. Some commentators will tell you they were the two largest cities. They were not the two largest cities. They were actually districts. There were cities in Teman and cities in Bozrah. One was named Teman, one was named Bozrah, but they were also the name of that district. Teman was in the south and Bozrah was in the north. So the implication is that judgment would come upon the whole land. And people, that's exactly what happened. In 732 BC, 10 years before the Assyrians came in and actually conquered Samaria and the upper Israel in 722 BC and took them into captivity, northern Israel. Tiglath-Pileser III invaded Edom and turned them into a vassal state. But they didn't destroy them, and they didn't exile them. So they escaped the fire that Amos prophesied would come upon them. But in 582 BC, the Babylonians invaded Edom and wiped them out, fulfilling Amos' prophecy. But this explains the migration process with Edom moving into southern Judea and the Nabateans moving into Edom. You see, between 586 BC, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and took all of the Jews into exile, and 582, when the Babylonians destroyed the territory of the Edomites and took them into exile, then you had this group of Edomites who moved in before the Babylonians came in. In between this time period, they moved in to southern Judah. And as I said, they occupied these cities and these homes that were left vacant by the exiled Jews. Now, the group who migrated into Judah, they escaped the judgment that came upon Edom. They didn't know what they were doing, but because they left and they migrated into this, hey, there's new cities here, and it's a better city than ours. These are better homes than ours. They have better land than ours. So about a third of them moved up, but what they didn't know is 4 years later, the Babylonians were coming and destroying the Edomites. So they escaped the judgment. But the Babylonians came in and they destroyed, and they did the same thing to Edom that they did to Jerusalem and to Judea. So they destroyed the cities. They took the people into exile. So now you have these empty homes and empty cities in Edom. So what happens? The Nabateans move in. In a 4-year period, you see this mass migration. You see the Edomites go into southern Judea. And you see the Nabateans, who had always been people that were in caravans, that were nomads in the desert. They move into Edom, and they start taking up these dwellings. So when you go to Petra, anyone ever been to Petra? They'll talk about the Nabateans. And they'll say, we don't know how they migrated. Yes, we do. It all took place within a 4-year period. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, here's the big question, because we want to relate this to today. Everything that we're talking about. One of the reasons I chose the book of Amos is because it applies so much to today. Do the Edomites exist today? Trick question. Do the Edomites exist today? Yes or no? Yes. Who are they? Anyone know? Who are the Edomites today? They are the Palestinians in Israel. And most of them are in the refugee camps you see on the news. Here's a picture of one of the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. See that? Those are tents. These refugees are on the border in Lebanon. They left Israel when the war took place. You know, when Israel declared their independence. I don't know if you know history at all. Hopefully you know a little bit of history. They dropped all these pamphlets the Muslim nations in, and they told them this is going to be a quick war. We got these 6 Muslim nations that are coming against Israel. It's going to be over. We're going to wipe them out. You'll be able to return to your homes, but you need to get out because we don't want you killed when we kill all these stinking Jews. And so they left their homes. And a great miracle took place because God had prophesied this would happen. The Jews kicked their butt with nothing. David and Goliath all over again. In 1967, the same thing. Yom Kippur War, same thing. They've always kicked their butts because God is on their side. And you ought to hear some of the stories from the Muslim side of some of the miraculous things that took place. But here's what happened. All these Palestinians who were Edomites, they're the ones who were living in the land for 2,000 years, but they were Edomites. That was not their land. They came in and took them when they went into exile, and then even when they came back, there wasn't enough, so they stayed in the land. So they're there. Now let me show you another picture. This is refugee camp. In fact, those of you who went with me, how many of you remember when we were in Jordan, we were going up the hill, and the guide said, there's a refugee camp. And you look down there and saw, this is it. This picture was taken in 2013. That's a refugee camp. All right? Now, do you see all those tents? Do you know what those tents are called? Anyone have a clue? If you're taking notes, write this down. The tents of Edom. Write that down. The tents of Edom. And the Bible talks about the tents of Edom in Psalm chapter 83. Now, Psalms 83 describes a war between Israel and its surrounding neighbors. Look at Psalms 83. We're going to read verses 2 through 8. It says, for behold, thine enemies make an uproar, and those who hate thee have exalted themselves. They make shrewd plans against thy people. Who's thy people? The Jews. And conspire against them, against thy treasured ones. They have said, come and let us wipe them out as a nation. Sound familiar? That the name of Israel be remembered no more. Now, people, this was written in David's time, 3,500 years ago. And this is exactly what they're saying today. For they have conspired together with one mind. The Muslim world is all together. They have an alliance. They might not have an alliance with each other. When it comes to Israel, though, boom. They hate Israel and they will work together. Against thee do they make a covenant. They can't make a covenant with each other, but they can make a covenant with each other against Israel. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites. Moab and the Hagarenes. Who's the Hagarenes? I already told you. Gebal and Ammon. And Ammon. And Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. Assyria also joined with them. They have become a help to the children of Lot. So the nations surrounding Israel are going to form a coalition to destroy Israel. And their goal is going to be to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Now, does that sound familiar? Well, of course it does. Every Muslim in the Middle East wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And they usually say something like this. We're going to push Israel into the sea and we're going to erase the name of Israel. We're going to wipe them off the face of the earth. Exactly what it says here in Psalms 83. Now let's see what countries are involved. First you have the tents of Edom. And who are the ancestors of the Palestinians living in Israel? The Edomites. And today most of the Palestinians are refugees and they're living in tents. So the phrase tents of Edom refers to Palestinian refugees. People, how in the world 3,500 years ago could they have prophesied this? Because the Edomites did not live in tents. They lived in cities and homes. So why would they say tents of Edom? Because this is a prophecy about today, the generation we are living in. And today they are living in tents. The Ishmaelites are Saudi Arabia. Moab and Ammon make up modern-day Jordan. The Hagarenes were Egyptians, so this is Egypt. Gebal is northern Lebanon. Amalek are the Arabs south of Israel. We're talking about the Bedouins in the Sinai Peninsula and the Negev. The Philistines are those in the Gaza Strip, which is Hamas. But here's what's interesting. The Philistines as a people no longer exist because they were wiped out by the Babylonians and they were carried into exile. So the Edomites moved into their vacant land, their cities and their homes. So the term Philistines is trying to tell us that it's referring to the Gaza Strip where the Philistines lived, but not to the Philistines as a people, but to the Philistines where they lived. So today we have people who are living in the Gaza Strip and they are what? They call themselves Palestinians, but they are who? Edomites. Edomites. Tyre is southern Lebanon, which is Hezbollah. And last but not least, Assyria is modern-day Syria and northern Iraq. So all of the nations that are surrounding Israel, which are the Muslim nations, want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And one day soon, They're going to form this coalition, and they're going to declare war on Israel. And though Psalms 83 doesn't say that Israel defeats them, it implies it. And the reason I say that is because Asaph prays for their defeat, and the implication is God grants his prayer. And then we're told in the book of Isaiah chapter 17 that when they attack, making reference to Psalm 83, God destroys these nations. Look at Isaiah chapter 17, verses 12 through 14. Listen, the armies of many nations roar like the roaring of the sea. Hear the thunder of the mighty forces as they rush forward like thundering waves. But though they thunder like breakers on a beach, God will silence them and they will run away. You see, you can go back in history and you don't have all these nations coming together and making coalition. So this is referring to Psalms 83 in case you didn't know that. They will flee like chaff scattered by the wind, like tumbleweed whirling before a storm. In the evening, Israel waits in terror. Because, everyone's coming against them. But by dawn, its enemies are dead. This is exactly what's happened in all these other past wars. And they were shaking in the boots. Yom Kippur, the reason the Arabs came on Yom Kippur is the most holy day. They're not allowed to use telephones. They're not allowed to use anything that's there. So here's what's interesting. They attack on the most holy day, and there's no way to get messages out to the army because no one is going to even use telephones. So here's what happens. The military sends people to go in the synagogues because this is where the synagogues are. And they tell them the Arabs are attacking us on the day of Yom Kippur, the most holy of all days. That's how filthy they are. And literally come out and God does a wonderful work. Miracles. You guys just need to read what God does. But anyways, this is the just reward of those who want to plunder us. Who's us? Israel. A fitting end for those who want to destroy us. Who's us? Israel. So this is referring to the war in Psalms 83. So the war described in Psalm 83 and Isaiah 15 sets the stage for the Magog invasion. Israel's ancient borders are going to be restored, and their victory will allow them to live peacefully, safely, and confidently in the land without any walls, gates, or bars, which sets them up for the Magog invasion right before the tribulation. Now, here's what's interesting, and we're going to close with this. But this is what you need to take away so you're educated on what's happening in the Middle East today, and you don't get carried away with these idiot liberals. I'm sorry, but that's true. Was that snarky? Yes, but it deserved to be snarky. So here goes. Edom has become the cat's paw of the Arabs, and they don't even know it. Now, does everyone know what that term means? Anyone ever read that? Everyone know what? That's a figure of speech. A cat's paw is a person who is used by another to carry out an unpleasant or dangerous task. Well, the Palestinians have been manipulated and used as propaganda to serve the purposes of Ishmael and Islam. And they're not even smart enough to know it. These Palestinians aren't even smart enough to know that they are being used as the cat's paw. You see, the Arab countries have more than enough land and more than enough natural resources to let them immigrate and assimilate into their countries, but they refuse to do that because they want to use them as political pawns. And yet, let me say this. This was all prophesied in the Bible. The book of Obadiah is one chapter, and it's all about Edom. Now, I want you to listen to what it says. This is a prophecy. Notice this. Write this down. You need to go home and underline this in your Bible and highlight it. Look what it says. All your allies will force you to the border. This is talking to the Edomites. And who are the Edomites today? The Palestinians. They will force you to the border. Where are the refugee camps? Does anyone know? They are in the borders in Lebanon between Israel and them. They're right on the border. You go to Jordan, are they in the middle of Jordan? Nope, they're right on the border. That's on the borders. When Syria, before they had that, where was it in Syria? Right on the border. Now here's what's interesting. All your allies will force you to the border. They will help to chase you from your land. They sent these pamphlets out. The reason they're refugees is they sent them out and told them to leave, and they left on their own. They will promise you peace while plotting to deceive and destroy you. Your trusted friends will set traps for you. And here's what's interesting. And you won't even know it. How sad. That's exactly what's happened. Let me tell you something. I want you to think of it like this. What if we rounded up all the illegal immigrants that have come in from Mexico and Southern America or South America, and we rounded them up, we took them down to the border, and we put them all in tents? What would you think of America? What kind of outcry would there be around the world? I can't believe America has all of those natural resources. They have enough land. They should allow them. They're keeping them in those tents. Here's what's interesting. No one has an outcry that Jordan, Syria before the war, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, none of them get upset that they're not allowing these refugees to come into their land. But they're keeping them in tents, and they won't let them into their land. No one gets upset with that. Why? Because that's what the Bible said would happen. And it all goes back to this intense hatred. And if you understand these things, when you see this taking place, you understand, people, God is in control. He's omnipresent. He's everywhere at all times. He knew exactly what was going to happen here. All these things were setting up. And before the Edomites ever dwelt in tents, in Psalm 83, he said, in the tents of Edom. And you thought, what in the world? Until this last generation. Because we are the generation that are going to see these things happen.